Okay, now that we've gone through all the different inferential processes in this unit, we're going to talk about something that happens when we run significance tests. So when I run a significance test, what could happen is I can make a mistake. I could reject the null hypothesis. I could say that whatever you're claiming is wrong, when in actuality it isn't wrong. Or conversely, I could say, hey, what you're saying, I can't prove it's incorrect, when actually it is incorrect. Those have names, and they're called type 1 errors and type 2 errors. So what I'm going to do is walk through the example we did in class. I'm going to talk about type 1, I'm going to talk about type 2, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about this other idea of what's called power. So we'll start with type 1 and type 2. Start with sharing the screen. So we'll take a look at this. Should Rockford switch to bottled water? The situation is the Wolverine Worldwide, a shoe company in Rockford, improperly disposed of chemicals which have leaked into the groundwater. The state of Michigan says that if more than 7% of the households in a city exceed the safe limit, the city needs to switch to bottled water. A concerned citizen takes a random sample of 100 households and finds that 12 have unsafe water. Do the data provide convincing evidence that Rockford should switch to bottled water? So we're going to talk about the null. We're going to talk about the alternative. So in this case, the null hypothesis is that our claim is in fact that 7%, that we're not above it, and that our alternative is that it exceeds it. So we're trying to prove that it's bad. So this is water is safe, and this is water is unsafe. Okay, so now, and we're talking about P is the true proportion of households, of all households. All households in Rockford with unsafe water. Okay, so now let's do a little bit of a review. After conducting a significance test, we find a p-value of 0.025. Interpret this value. And what we're going to say, assuming the water is safe, which is my null hypothesis, the likelihood of getting the observed result or more extreme is 0.025. So basically, in this case, it's an unlikely event. It's not very likely that this should happen. So in this case, since my p-value of 0.025 is less than my significance level, my alpha of 0.05, we're going to go ahead and we're going to reject the null hypothesis. There is evidence to support the claim the water is unsafe. Okay, so now we're going to get into the types of errors we can make. So here's the first type of error. Let's say this decision's wrong. What would a consequence of this error be? So in this case, what ends up happening is we're saying that it's bad water when it's actually not bad water. Consequence of this is Rockford's going to spend a lot of money. It's going to spend a whole lot of money, spend dollars on bottled water when they didn't need to. That money could have been better spent somewhere else. That money could have been used better elsewhere. So that was right there. This guy right here has the name, and this guy, what he's called is he's called a type 1 error. A type 1 error is when I reject the null hypothesis when in fact the null hypothesis is true. So again, so the way I want to say it is type 1 error, I reject the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is actually true. So that's the first type of error I can make. It's called the type 1 error. So the next question says, if the water is safe, what is the probability that this error would occur? And if we look at this, the probability of committing a type 1 error is equal to 5%. That just so happens to be our significance level. So what I'm going to tell you is the significance level is also, so this is my significance level. I'm also setting the probability of making a type 1 error. Type 1 error. Okay, so that's my first type error. My first type error is a type 1 error. I reject the null when I should not have. Now let's take a look and see what the next one is. Now let's say that we were running a completely different scenario, and what we have is we have a p-value of 0.27 or 0.217. Sorry, 0.217. So in this case, since my p-value of 0.217 is greater than my alpha of 0.05, we failed to reject the null hypothesis. There isn't evidence to support the claim the water is unsafe. Okay, so now in this case, what we did is we failed to reject the null hypothesis. So again, what I'm saying here is the following. We said that everything's good when in actuality the water's bad. So let's suppose this decision is wrong. What could be a consequence of that action? We let people continue to drink unsafe water. And you know, they could get sick. And in this case, this guy has a name. This guy is called a type 2 error. A type 2 error is where I fail to reject the null when I should have. So a type 2 error is where I say, type 2 error is where I say, I fail to reject the null when in actuality that alternative is true. So basically I should have concluded that the water is unsafe, but I didn't. So, and then in this case, the follow-up question is like, are the consequences in type question 2 or question 3 more serious? In this case, what we're doing is we're comparing wasting dollars. We're comparing it to drinking unsafe water. Well, that's what we're doing, comparing these two. In this case, I would say this. I would say question 3 is more serious. And the reason that it's more serious is people drinking unhealthy water it could lead to them dying. Whereas wasting money, while it's not great in the grand scheme of things, you'd rather waste money than waste people's lives. So that's our type 1 and our type 2 error. And really what I want to kind of show you is a good kind of table for that. So this is kind of a table that you can kind of use as a reference. Is what we talked about in class. Here is our idea of type 1s and type 2 errors. So again, if we look at this table here, type 1 error, if I reject the null and the null is true, I made a type 1 error. So basically, if I say that the water is unsafe, when in actuality it's safe, I've committed a type 1 error. If I reject the null and the alternative is true, I made a good decision. I did what I should. If I fail to reject the null and the null is true, that's a good decision. So again, if I said the water is safe and the water is actually safe, that's good. Type 2, I say the water is safe when it's actually unsafe. So let me kind of put it in the context of a court of law and hope maybe this is another way that you can think about it. This is just another way to think about it. If you think about the court of law, we say that you're innocent until proven guilty. That's the whole idea of a court. We never find anyone, we're innocent until proven guilty. And in this case, when we come out of this decision, there's type 1 and type 2 error. So again, the null hypothesis is you're not guilty. The alternative is you're guilty. We're trying to prove that you're guilty. So again, here's all of the situations. The H-naught is true. In actuality, you are not guilty. This is what, if the H-naught is true, you're not guilty. If the alternative is true, you are guilty. Now let's say the decision in the court. Let's say the decision in the court, they find you not guilty. Make sure I'm lining this up the right way. Let's say the decision is you're guilty, or the decision is you're not guilty. So in this case, if you're guilty, if they find you guilty and you were really not guilty, we committed a type 1 error. What we did is we found an innocent person guilty. We committed a type 1 error. In this case, if you're found guilty and you were actually guilty, we made the right decision. Now let's say instead, you were not guilty. And we found you not guilty. You were not guilty, we found you not guilty. We made the right decision. Now let's say you were found not guilty, but you actually did it. In this case, we committed a type 2 error. So a type 1 error is where we find an innocent person guilty. A type 2 error is where we find a guilty person not guilty in this case. So that's kind of in the court of law analogy. So that's our type 1 and type 2 error. So what I'm going to do is a separate video that's going to talk a little bit about power, which kind of builds into this. And I want to have just a separate video that you can watch on that.